This agenda item. The vote will take place later today. Our agenda now has a further debate. This is on the situation in Cuba. We'll start with a round of the rapporteurs. Mr. Lopez Gil will be the first speaker. You have the floor.
Gracias, señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, President. Commissioner. From the EPP group, we will never tire in announcing how serious the situation is in which all Cubans find themselves within and outside the country, and we need to do our utmost to fight repression, abuse, torture, disappearances and murders of defenders of human rights, journalists, students, and anyone who demonstrates. We need to stop this completely. Political prisoners need to be released, and we need proper democracy and the rule of law in Cuba. This debate on these resolutions are extremely necessary. As representatives of European people, we are aware of the will to change things. Europe stands alongside all Cuban democrats that suffer against the dictatorship, and they all want it to end. The Cuban regime doesn't just fight against people that are against it inside Cuba, but those people that are abroad. They want to export their totalitarian way of operating to the rest of the region. We've seen that those countries that don't have democratic systems, strong democratic systems, have fallen foul to them. The Cuban regime recently held a summit of human rights violators where the worst dictators of the region were there to set out their roadmap for the future. The EU is an international player, and it's very strong. It has a lot of prestige, and it shouldn't be scared to speak against the barbarity. I call upon you strongly. I call upon the High Representative to listen to the will of the Parliament. We have an agreement with the island. We have common principles. None of this is being respected. The same goes for the Sakharov Prize. People feel abandoned by our institutions who haven't helped to get rid of the regime, which is why now we would like in the next Council of Foreign Ministers to activate Clause 86, Para 3, that could lead to the suspension of the agreement, and for there to be sanctions for those people responsible for violations of human rights. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Und wir kommen weiter.
And now we move on to the next author, Ms. Charanzova.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Bueno, la Unión Europea es...
Thank you very much. The EU stands alongside the Cubans, but we need to do more to help them to move towards democracy. Last week, the Sakharov prizes for Cuba went where they never did before. But the EU still isn't taking concrete steps in the face of violations of human rights in Cuba. The situation in the country is getting worse and worse. More repression, more violations of human rights, more political prisoners, and no advance in commitments for the agreement that we started on 5 years ago. I've got a specific question to the High Representative. Why aren't we calling for an urgent meeting with Cuba as laid down in the agreement? That's one way that we could clearly show that we take the commitments under the agreement seriously and that we really want to help improve the life of Cuban people. And we need a concrete response, concrete action. Cubans are suffering considerably and they need our help and support now. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Frau Kollegin Scharanz.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, the next author, Mr. Terch. You have the floor.
Buenos días a todos.
Good morning, everybody. In a cell with water dripping from the ceiling, people are dying as prisoners. In Quimican, Roberto Fonseca, 34 years, has been condemned for 30 years for false charges, as many other people of the 600 Cuban people that are prisoners and are condemned to long prison sentences. They're there because they fought for freedom on the 11th of November. That was seen by the External Action Services led by Mr. Borrell as linked to Mr. Trump's sanctions. There is a huge amount of manipulation that we've reached here with this obsession that the High Representative and his team have to defend dictatorships, the communist dictatorships of Latin America and particularly Cuba, so much that the region sees the EU as propping up the dictatorship, and the Cuban Sakharov Prize winners said they'd rather return the prizes because of the shameful silence that's coming from the EU, from Mr. Borrell and his team and the Commission. They're not doing anything. I would like to congratulate everyone, wish everyone a good Christmas. The political prisoners, I would like them to know we're behind them, and we need to fight strongly for a free Cuba, Bolivia, Nicaragua and Venezuela. Thank you.
Dankeschön, Herr.
Thank you very much. And now, Ms. Latau Marques.
Obrigada, Senhora Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Well, on the 18th of November in 2021, Miquel Castillo received the Grammy for the Best Urban Music and Song of the Year. He was celebrating it in the prison in Cuba and not on the stage in Las Vegas. His song played with the slogan of Fidel Castro, Fatherland or Death, and it's an anthem for the freedom of the Cuban people. The same has happened with the rights of musicians, artists and civil rights activists. The noose around their necks has been tightening, and no artist should be put in prison for creating art. The route needs to be changed around completely, and the cooperation agreement with Cuba can actually be used to exert pressure. What we want to do is not break down the dialogue with Cuba. In Cuba, as in other Latin American countries, and I've recently visited Venezuela, what we've seen is that it's through inclusive political dialogue that we can achieve results, not sanctions that affect the daily lives of citizens. All too often, the result is that the people who are sanctioned are actually strengthened, and that rather undermines the leaders if we do not sanction them.
Thank you very much. Mr. Solé, you have the floor.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you very much, President. This is the third resolution, the third debate on Cuba that we've had in the Parliament this year. And I can't say anything different to what I said last time when we talked about Cuba in September. Three very clear messages. The first one is to deplore and speak out against, to criticise the response, the authoritarian response that the Cuban government is still meting out to any expression of dissidence in the public world, in art, and anything that's remotely political that comes from the opposition. The Cuban government needs to respect the right to peacefully demonstrate, the right to free expression, and I think the government in Cuba is wrong if it's thinking that given that the march on the 15th didn't happen, there's no problem. But that's not true. There's frustration there. Socio-economic situation is terrible, and that's why people want to demonstrate. Secondly, when the Commission makes the resolution on Cuba, it's not balanced unless there is criticism of the US blockade, which has an impact on the socio-economic situation the Cubans are under. Thirdly, we think that political dialogue and cooperation between Cuba and the European Union is exactly where we should carry on helping the Cuban people towards more democracy and freedom. Thank you.
Ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr
Thank you very much. The next author, Mr. Pineda. You have the floor.
Gracias, President.
Thank you very much, President. This resolution has come as mandated by the boss here, and it still lays down the same lies that happened before. In Cuba, there isn't arbitrary detention, torture, or disappearance of people. There aren't people in prison. The only violation of human rights in Cuba goes back 70 years, and you don't even say that in your resolution. The Cuban government, because of the heroic revolution, is putting people at the heart of human rights and so on. You can't carry on with all of this, particularly in the midst of the pandemic. It's become an example of violations of human rights, but it has the lowest rate of child poverty. There aren't children dying in the streets and so on. It has the second best rights levels of health in the world. It's a participatory democracy with strong roots, and they have free votes of the representative each year. They send people to the assembly. These people know what it means to be the Americans' poodles, and they will carry on defending rights and will find victory at all times.
Thank you very much. That was the round of authors. So we have the first round of the group speakers, starting with Mr. López Istúriz White, who's speaking from Madrid.
Muchas gracias, señora presidenta. Tenemos...
Thank you very much, President. We have a moral debt, and people are paying with their rights in human rights terms. They don't have the rights that we have here. Two Sakharov prizes have come back here, and they're calling for the regime to be persecuted. It's not adhering to minimum standards. We have recognised what's going on here, and with the vote of all groups, we bestow the Sakharov Prize. Disappointed by the support of the EU because of what's going on, particularly criticising Mr. Borrell and the EEAS. And that's why the prize winners want to return their prizes as a form of protest. We want Mr. Fariñas and others to not give up their prizes because they are supported by elected representatives in the EP, and that's a strong message to the EES and Mr. Borrell. The last two resolutions from this chamber show the terrible reality that prize winners have. Since 2016, the situation's got worse: torture, persecution of people, and what's more, organisations of the regime are being funded from the EU. None of those organisations that were given the Sakharov Prize have been funded. Mr. Borrell of the EU and everyone needs to wake up to the persecution and torture of this bloody regime. I wonder where we're going to get the bravery to stand up against the direct dictatorship and point the finger when the far left is offended, the previous speaker who thinks it's a great thing, and they're saying Happy Christmas to these people. How are we going to stand up to all of this? Happy Christmas to everybody, and particularly Cuban prisoners.
Dankeschön, Herr Kollege.
Thank you very much. Greetings to Madrid. Here in the chamber will continue Mr. Garcia del Blanco for the S&D Group.
Gracias, Presidenta.
Thank you, President. Most countries in the world aren't under democracy. They are regimes that oppress their citizens more or less, and they restrict fundamental freedoms, public freedoms. If we had the same type of debate that we have with some countries, such as Cuba and Venezuela, probably we wouldn't have time to hold all these meetings and hold all those resolutions. This is a political issue that goes beyond just human rights, which is what we're talking about here once again. This is to do with the political agenda of certain groups and national agendas in some countries, which are affected by this issue more directly. This means, well, just that, but also it means that we need to stress that Cuba is a dictatorship. It needs to move towards democracy. It needs to respect human rights, and also we need to talk about lifting the blockade, which only has led to more political blockades. We keep on looking at how to get over the 60 years of dictatorship. Thank you.
Thank you very much. On we go for the groups. Next, Mr. Bausa Diaz for Renew.
Muchas gracias, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Friends, at the moment, a good friend of mine, Jose Daniel Ferreira, is fighting for his life in a cell in a Cuban prison, and there are hundreds of political prisons in that situation. Mr. Borrell is not here in this debate. Yesterday, he talked about Nicaragua and said that there aren't left or right wing dictatorships, but just dictatorships we need to fight against with democracy. And I can agree more, which is why I don't understand that why with Cuba, Mr. Borrell and other members, such as we've heard from, aren't fighting for this. In Cuban prisons, hundreds of people are up against death on a daily basis just because they defended freedom and democracy and human dignity and human rights for Cuban people. Don't Cubans deserve the same rights that we have and that we call upon other people to uphold? Which is why, ladies and gentlemen, I call upon all of you to support the resolution, to support democratic people like Jose Daniel and other people who we hope will be freed soon, and we're calling for now.
Gracias.
Thank you very much. The next speaker, Ms. Ciccardi from the ID Group. You have the floor.
Last night I was called from Cuba at 3 o'clock in the morning. I heard they are repressing our family. It's a cousin who's like a sister to me. In August she was taken out of her post at work. She's a radiologist. The Federation of Cuban Women were violent towards her. She was persecuted and she was forced to go back to her husband's house where he was infected with COVID. Now I've escaped, but if anything happens to me, I'm going to have to try and explain what happened. Just because I denounced the dictatorship. This was sent to me by an Italian citizen who's worried about her own family. We all know the situation in this house. For all too many, Cuba is a toxic love affair. Despite all of the abuse and the firing squads and torture, that there are still too many to defend it. This is the methods of the last century. The so-called order battalions. The Cuban population are being oppressed. Calling the communist regime the Republic of Cuba is a contradiction in terms. A republic should allow for free elections, but since 1959, only pretend elections have been held, where no other parties are allowed. Similar to the 2018 elections. All of the members elected were members of the Cuban Communist Party. Cuba might protest around the world against shortages of food and medicines around the world, but there is a thirst for rights and democracy among the Cuban people. We are now seeing the biggest protests on the island since 1994. Let justice be done. Let us use the instruments we have available to us. Let's use the human rights clause that allows us to suspend the partnership and cooperation agreement. Let's try and increase the international pressure on this pitiless, bloody regime. Viva Cuba Libre.
Thank you very much. Now, for 1 minute, Ms. Fotiga.
Thank you, Chair. For the third time, despite COVID restrictions, we refer to urgent procedures to expose atrocities by Cuban communist regime against its own people. Not to speak about full debates when we discuss all issues. Yes, we do have agreement with Cuba, but to provide argumentation to one of the authors, there are no common values, no common principles between us. There are deep systemic differences, and we have to act quickly, decisively, resolutely to defend people, to impose sanctions and to prevent spreading of this kind of policies, kind of Stalinist policies to all other parts of the Latin American region. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For 1 minute, Ms. Pereira.
Obrigada, Presidente.
Thank you very much, President. Well, once again, we're talking about Cuba in this House. We've done that plenty of times in this plenary, and that shows how the instrumentalization of supposed violations of human rights are used as a weapon for interfering in other countries' affairs. The resolutions may be different, but the objectives are always the same. Putting a question mark over the achievements of the sovereignty and independence of Cuba, interfering in the process of normalizing the relationships between the EU and Cuba through the cooperation agreements. Countries of Latin America, in many cases, are disrespecting the North America rather is disrespecting the independence of the Cuban people. Instead, we need a relationship based on mutual respect. We need an end to the criminal blockade. We need to normalize relations with Cuba and its people, and we need to follow their example of sovereignty and struggle.
Thank you very much. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Nicolau Alavanos.
El Parlamento y la Comisión Europea hoy dan continuación.
The Parliament and the Commission today, we have an intervention plan against Cuba. It is said that there are infringements of human rights. Agents are being protected and who have links with various agencies. So there's a call for intervention, but the demonstrations and support of the revolution, solidarity with people in Cuba and the communist government in Cuba, of course, supports the imperialist plans of the US and the EU. And then there's this embargo and the 275 sanctions maintained by the two governments. It means that this is a sort of crime, this embargo. Cuba stands for the defense of the achievements of the revolution. Cuba will be victorious. Thank you very much. For 2 minutes, Mr. Kelly.
The peaceful demonstrations that took place in Cuba on November the 15th were a courageous effort to force the communist government to make democratic change. This call for Cuba to transition to a more open civil society has been invigorated recently by a number of factors, namely the widespread hardship brought about by the pandemic, a surge in the use of social media, bringing together different groups such as the opposition group Archipelago, and a new generation that is hungry for change, change that has been far too long in coming. Around 600 dissidents were already detained in Cuba prior to the demonstration, but this did not deter the Archipelago group from calling for a new protest. I commend the bravery of these groups. Here in Parliament, not too many years ago, we presented the esteemed Sakharov Prize to the Ladies in White, a brave group of women who carried out peaceful protests in response to the brutal rounding up and imprisonment of 75 dissidents in Cuba in 2005. That day they told us, "We believe in ourselves, but we rely on you." I was saddened to hear that a member of this group, Amara Nieto, is currently imprisoned. Indeed, President Sassoli highlighted yesterday, while presenting the Sakharov Prize to Alexei Navalny, all the previous Sakharov Prize winners still in prison all over the world. Perhaps in 2022, the European Parliament and the European Commission could organise an event of major proportion to highlight the plight of all Sakharov Prize winners still imprisoned. What do you think, Mr. Commissioner? I call for the immediate and unconditional release of all those detained for the exercise of their rights of freedom and expression and peaceful assembly, and I urge the Council to adopt sanctions against those responsible for human rights violations in Cuba.
Thank you very much. Now for 1 minute, Ms. Rodriguez Ramos.
Gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. Cuba is one of the worst dictatorships that we have in Latin America today. And as the High Representative has said on this same stage, they don't have ideology except for repression and terror. In November, the Human Rights Observatory in Cuba said there were over 1,300 acts of repression with members of the opposition, artists, miners, journalists. There are opposition people and dissidents in all Cuban prisons, and the regime has been around for over 60 years. There is repression inside and outside Cuba. Cuban women are at the forefront of this, but there's terrible cruelty towards these people. They need to move on towards democracy. They need to move on politically. They need inclusive dialogue. The EU needs to be there, holding out a hand, not for lack of action, but holding out a hand for the Cuban people to freedom.
Thank you very much. Now for 1 minute, Mr. Royson.
Voorzitter, geachte commissaris.
Thank you very much, President, Commissioner. Thank you for coming to speak about this difficult situation for many Cubans. There's only one way out: peaceful protest. But this was beaten down. There was a counter demonstration for the revolution, which was organized. The system sees oppression of others as the only way to hide its own weakness. And as regards Christians and religious freedom, it can't be taken for granted in Cuba. We've seen that already. The legislative process is often discriminatory and arbitrary, and this means many people who come to church have to fear sanctions. The Foreign Service must speak about freedom of religion. Mr. Kelleher, 1 minute.
I utterly condemn the attacks on freedom of expression, arbitrary imprisonment, detaining political opponents, forced labour camps, censorship and political re-education of minorities by the Cuban regime. Be it a totalitarian regime on the left or on the right, we must condemn in equal measure both, because both are fundamentally anathema to what this House stands for. And I am surprised to listen to some people, because of their ideological views on the left, that will stand here in this Parliament that affords us huge luxuries and opportunities in terms of freedom and defend the Cuban regime, which has persecuted its people for years. It is not so long ago when Cuban people weren't even allowed to leave their country, and they wanted to leave it by the hundreds of thousands. So let us be very clear. Condemn totalitarian regimes that are corrupt on the right and that are corrupt on the left. I stand for the centre, I stand for liberty and freedom, and I stand with the Cuban people. Shame on those who support the Cuban regime as it is.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kelleher. Finally, to round off, Commissioner Lenarčič, please.
Mr. President, honourable members, the protests in Cuba on 11 July and 15 November reflected legitimate grievances of the Cuban people about the dire economic situation in the country. But they also had an important political dimension, with citizens demanding freedom of expression and of the press, civil and political rights, in short, democracy. The European Union unequivocally supports the right of Cuba's citizens to express their views peacefully and demand change. We have repeatedly called on the Cuban authorities to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including freedom of association and peaceful assembly, to release people arbitrarily detained, and to engage in an inclusive dialogue on the grievances of its citizens. The cases of Cubans facing repression following the events of 11 July and 15 November are of great concern to us. And as we have repeatedly declared, the European Union expects Cuba to respect every citizen's fundamental freedoms and human dignity, including access to justice and the right to a fair trial. Already in July this year, the High Representative Vice President Borrell urged the Cuban government to release all arbitrarily detained protesters. And since then, the EU has regularly raised the cases of individuals facing repression with the Cuban authorities at all levels, both in Havana and here in Brussels, and will continue to do so. Human rights are an essential part of the political dialogue and cooperation agreement that we have with Cuba. The EU reiterates its policy of critical engagement with Cuba in the framework of this agreement. We will continue to demand full respect of human rights and fundamental freedoms. We will continue to promote and support reforms which are more necessary than ever in order to improve the lives of the Cuban people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Lenarčič. That concludes that debate. The vote is today, according to the